Okay, we're going to get started pretty soon, so if everyone can take their seats. If you're a member of the advisory group, please come to the main table. As people are doing that, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So I'm Philip Fine. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer here at South Coast. So in the room, please place your cell phones on silent or vibrate so we don't get interrupted. Many of you know the restrooms are out the back door, under the exit sign, through the next door, and then to your left. In the event of an emergency, we may need you to shelter in place or evacuate, so just follow instructions. You can see the exit signs to the front and back of me. There's quite a few people on the phone, so please, if you're on the phone, make sure you're on mute so we don't get any background noise. We have had problems in recent working group meetings, not AQMP, advisory group meetings with background noise. So please mute your phone, and there will be a chance for you to chime in with questions as we move forward. And don't put us on hold. We don't need background music. But judging by the number of beeps, we have 20 to 30 people that are on the line. Okay, is everyone ready to get started? All right, so welcome everyone. This is getting a new group back together in a sense. This is the AQMP advisory group. Our board approved the membership at the last board meeting last week. Many of you have been involved in these activities before as the district develops their air quality management plans. This is really the kickoff meeting for an air quality management plan that we actually have due in 2022 for a new ozone standard that EPA set in 2015 of 70 parts per billion. That attainment date is in 2037. However, there is some unfinished business from our last AQMP. So the first task in front of us will be dealing with that task. And that's mostly what we're going to focus on today and in the subsequent meetings for the rest of the year, as you'll see. So before we get started, at least at the main table, let's do introductions. There's just too many people on the phone to do introductions. But at least at the main table, again, I'm Philip Fine, Deputy Executive Officer, Planning Division at AQMD.
I'm Sarah Reese. I'm an Assistant Deputy Executive Officer in Planning.
Kurt Carperis. I'm Deputy Executive Officer for the California Air Resources Board.
Sylvia Vandersbeck. I'm Chief of Air Quality Planning at the California Air Resources Board.
Megan Lorenz. I'm in the legal office at the AQMD.
Dwayne Baker, San Bernardino County Transportation Authority.
Dan McGivney, SoCal Gas.
David Rothbard, Southern California Alliance of Publicly Owned Treatment Works.
Hit the button until you get a green light.
Adam Wood, Building Industry Association.
Richard Parks from Redeemer Community Partnership in South LA.
Hi, Tammy Yamasaki, Southern California Edison.
Lakshmi Jairam, Future Ports.
Carla De La Cruz, the Sierra Club.
Peter Herzog with NAP, the Commercial Real Estate Development Association.
Thomas Yelenich, PMSA.
Tim DeMoss, Port of LA.
Andy Silva, County of San Bernardino.
Rongsheng Luo, Southern California Association of Governments.
Alyssa Beltran, LA County Department of Public Health.
Alex Fong, San Gabriel Valley Council of Governments.
Mike Carroll, Latham and Watkins for Regulatory Flexibility Group.
Francis Keeler with SEEB.
Brittany Gallivan in Planning, South Coast Air Quality Management District.
Kelly Gamino, Air Quality Specialist at the district.
Brian Cho in Planning, South Coast AQMD.
Sang-Mi Lee, Program Supervisor at AQMD.
Kalam Chang, Program Supervisor, AQMD.
Zorik Pirvasian, Planning and Rules Manager, South Coast AQMD.
On the phone. It's too many people. Normally we do introductions on the phone, but I think it would be a little bit unwieldy with how many people we have on the phone. Did we have a way of knowing who called in? Did people identify themselves on this type of conference line. What do you think? We could try it. It's gonna be it's gonna be rough. I think we're just gonna forego that this time. You know you can email us with your attendance on the phone, and we'll try to work out something better for next time. And I do want to thank our colleagues from California Air Resources Board who joined us and came down today. Obviously, air quality management plans are a joint effort between the districts and the Air Resources Board, and both for the 2022 AQMP we'll be talking about, but also for the upcoming submittal. So just to kick things off, what we're going to talk about today is just a little bit about this advisory group, which was just constituted. And then we'll get into what some of the upcoming air quality management plan or SIP obligations to EPA are coming up. And then this third item is an update on the AQMP implementation from 2016. And then finally, we'll get into the heart of the matter and the document that we released yesterday, the draft document, in terms of this contingency measure plan that we must submit to EPA by the end of the year. So just really briefly, the purpose of this group, for those of you that are new, is to review the aspects of the air quality management plan, make recommendations on all the aspects of it, including emissions inventories, modeling, control measures, economic impacts. There's a lot of underlying technical documents, fostering a coordinated approach toward overall attainment strategies, and these technical issues that come up. And there will be a corresponding scientific, technical, and modeling peer review group that has always met in corresponding to these AQMP advisory group meetings. They include some of the members on the AQMP advisory group to really dig into some of the technical issues on inventory and modeling and attainment demonstrations. So this will be no different moving into 2022. The total membership this time is 68. I think for 2016 AQMP, it was in the low 50s, so we have even more people, as you can tell by the bigger circle we tried to construct today. Although if the attendance stays at this level, we'll shrink the circle again. But we do have, we've just broken it down here between business. It's made up of a diverse group of stakeholders as this advisory group was designed. Here it is. From 2014, as it was last constituted, it was 55 members, and now we're 68. 49 members are continuing. Some people we asked did not want to continue or combine membership, and then we have 19 new members. So that's the easy part of an AQMP process. Now we'll get into some of the meat of what we're going to discuss today. So next is Zorik's going to take over.
So next few slides, I will just provide a brief update on our upcoming SIP obligations, as Phil mentioned, and also a brief update on the 2016 AQMP implementation before we get into the heart of the matter. So in terms of our upcoming SIP obligations, as you see, the first item is related to the 1997 8-hour ozone standard for the South Coast Air Basin. We have an attainment date of June 15, 2024. When we submitted the 2016 Air Quality Management Plan, a portion of the emission reductions that were allocated for attainment demonstration were based on what's called Section 182E5 measures reductions. And Clean Air Act essentially allows extreme non-attainment areas to rely on emission reductions that are based on new technologies or improvement of existing technologies that are not quite defined yet. So the last AQMP 2016 Air Quality Management Plan relied on those reductions as well as defined measures that we'll talk about more in the next several slides. The same section of the Clean Air Act also requires contingency measures to be submitted 3 years before the attainment date to ensure that the reductions associated with these measures are addressed. And we'll talk a lot more about this item. The next item is related to the, again, 1997 8-hour ozone standard for Coachella Valley, which was reclassified from severe 15 to extreme non-attainment a few months ago. we requested EPA to reclassify Coachella Valley to extreme non-attainment earlier this year in June, and the request was granted by EPA. And subsequently, EPA has proposed action to for district to provide a SIP revision to demonstrate attainment of this standard by 2024. And in their latest proposal, they're asking for the submittal date to be July of 2020. We have requested EPA to give us additional time so we can go through a sufficient public review process and be able to revise our NSR and Title V regulations and also develop contingency measures. So the final deadline is pending EPA's final determination. And as Phil said, the next comprehensive air quality management plan is will be addressing the new 70 ppb 8-hour ozone standard for both South Coast Air Basin and Coachella Valley, with attainment dates of 2038 and 2033 for South Coast Air Basin and Coachella Valley. By August of next year, we're required to submit a base inventory and also do a RACT determination. This is the reasonable available control technology determination, which is based on EPA's latest control technique guidelines. We're also supposed to do an NSR demonstration by 2021 and submit the entire attainment plan by August of 2022. So next slide pretty much summarizes what I just said about the scope of the 2022 AQMP in terms of addressing the 2015 standard as a main purpose, but also we'll be updating the attainment demonstrations for the other air quality standards. In terms of the 2016 AQMP implementation, I have a couple of slides to share here. For the South Coast AQMD measures, slide kind of summarizes the rules that have been adopted since the adoption of the 2016 AQMP, architectural coatings, adhesives and sealant applications, gas-fired furnaces, power plants. A series of reclaim transition rules were adopted, 1135, 1134, and 1146 series, as well as the 9 refinery flares. The adoption dates and estimated reductions are in the slide, so I won't go over that. And also there's a series of upcoming rules that are being developed and are under development right now, ranging from IC engines, refinery equipment, glass melting furnaces, miscellaneous sources, and other categories that are mentioned on this slide. In the last AQMP, as you recall, AQMD also proposed a number of mobile source control measures. Included in those were what we call the facility-based mobile source measures that were intended to reduce emissions from sources such as airports, ports, rail yards, warehouses, and new and redevelopments under district actions. Following the AQMP adoption, there were a number of working groups that were established, and there were recommendations made to the board. And in May of 2018, our governing board provided directions to staff to pursue development of MOUs for ports and airports, and essentially ISRs for rail yards and warehouses, and also studies for new development, redevelopment areas. Projects. In terms of the upcoming actions, the MOU for the airports is expected to be presented to our board in December of this year. For the ports, we expect that the public hearing to be early next year, following ports' adoption of their truck rate next month. And as I said, with final adoption of the MOUs in early next year. And under new redevelopment projects, there's a RFP that is released for construction equipment and technology cost study, and ISRs are also expected to be developed next year for rail yards and warehouses. Several of our AQMD stationary source measures had incentive components, and because of that, in January of 2018, we released an RFP to incentivize reductions from both stationary and mobile sources, and also conduct demonstration technology projects. We had quite interest in this RFP. We actually received 81 proposals. 58 of them were technically qualified, requesting for about $200 million. Eventually, out of those 58 proposals, 26 projects were awarded, totaling about $48 million. covering both projects in stationary and mobile source categories in terms of deployment projects and also technology demonstration projects. Again, ranging from zero emission vans to zero emission hybrid terminal equipment like rubber tire gantry cranes, refrigeration transport units, tugboats, hybrid tugboats, after treatment technologies for hovercraft, and all electric refuse trucks. And also under stationary sources ranging from residential energy efficiency project to street sweeping, controls for restaurants, and residential fuel cells. In total, we anticipate that we get about 88 tons a year of NOx reductions from deployment projects. Again, this doesn't include the potential reductions that we might be getting from technology demonstration projects. But at least for the deployment projects, the anticipated level of reduction is about 88 tons per year of NOx and about 2 tons of PM2.5. Also, a quick slide on CARB's activities since the adoption of the AQMP. CARB has adopted the South Coast on-road heavy-duty vehicle incentive measure, which was part of their SIP strategy. This measure is essentially an incentive measure that would be achieving about 1 ton per day of NOx reduction in 23 based on conversion of about 1,300 heavy-duty trucks to near-zero engine trucks. And it would essentially may provide a template for offering or developing future incentive projects going forward. Heavy-duty vehicle emission control system warranty regulation was also adopted in 2018. CARB also adopted the zero-emission airport shuttle regulation that essentially requires a schedule for 100% electrification of airport shuttles, I think by 2035. A zero-emission powertrain certification regulation was also adopted in 2019, as well as an electric vehicle supply equipment standards. And CARB is in the process of updating their existing at-work regulation, as many of you are aware, and the scheduled adoption is December of this year. I think that's my section. I'm gonna.
All right, before we get into this contingency plan, is there any questions up till now on AQMP implementation or some of the obligations we have to EPA over the next couple years? Nothing? Anyone on the phone want to have any questions thus far? Okay, so with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah to get into the document that you have before you.
Thanks. So I'm going to go into what's more of the meat of this substance we want to talk about today, about our draft contingency measure plan, the document that we released late yesterday, and then go through more of the details on that. So for folks who are following on the phone right now, I'm on slide 18 or slide 16. So start a little bit about some of the progress that we've made over time. And you can see on this chart where we started in 1997, our baseline on NOx emissions was over 1,000 tons per day. We've come down substantially since then, so we've made a lot of progress, and that's the good news story of this. But we still have a ways to go, and so we need to get down to our carrying capacity of 141 tons per day, and there's still a little, some more reductions that we need to make to get there. So on the next slide, showing how our ozone design values have been trending down over time, which again is another good news story. They've come down fairly significantly. The bad news is they're still above the standards that we need to attain, and we have been seeing a little bit of an uptick over the last few years in design values. We're taking a look at that to try to evaluate the factors that go into that, but in general, we have been making some progress. And then also on the next slide, looking at basin precursor emissions, they've also been decreasing, which backs up the story that we're seeing with our decreasing ozone values. And then for the following slide, we have on our NO2 concentrations in the basin. So what we're observing in the atmosphere is still continuing to go down. So we're starting to see the effects of the measures that have been implemented over time and be able to get the emission reductions we need. So on to slide 20, NOx emission reductions really are what we're focusing on and why we're concerned so much with NOx emissions. From our 2016 AQMP, for the modeling that we did, it shows that that's really the most efficient path for us. We do get ozone reductions when we reduce VOCs, but reducing VOCs alone isn't enough, and NOx is really the way that's more efficient for us to meet those goals. So in our 2016, our overall control strategy on NOx, this just kind of shows a breakout of the emissions and the reductions that we need. Our 2023 baseline emissions are 269 tons per day. I mentioned before our carrying capacity, which is the amount of emissions that we can have in the atmosphere and be able to attain the standard, is 141. Total emission reductions that we had in our plan, when you add them all up, are 135 tons per day. Of that, 27 tons per day are from defined measures that we had in place. But then we had 108 tons per day, what we call a future deployment of cleaner technologies. There's a provision in the Clean Air Act that allows for us to point to the development of future technologies instead of having specifically defined measures in. It's something that we can do for ozone, for extreme ozone non-attainment areas. But when you add all of these up and then you account for a set-aside budget that we have, we get down to the levels that we need to do to get to our carrying capacity. Breaking this out further of what this looks like for our 2016 AQMP, that 108 tons of further deployment, we broke that down by specific categories. So you can see that there's some emission reductions that are allocated for the different types of mobile source emissions, so on-road, locomotives, aircrafts, ocean-going vessels, trucks, etc. So the provision I was mentioning before, this Clean Air Act, Section 182E5, it just allows for extreme non-attainment areas for ozone like us. And it's really to allow for the anticipated development of future technologies. So recognizing that there's advancements that are happening all the time. When you're in extreme non-attainment, you have a longer pathway by which to attain. So recognizing there will be new technologies developed during that time frame that will eventually get us into attainment. As part of that, though, you have to submit a contingency measure 3 years in advance of the attainment deadline, because at some point you get really close to the date by which you have to attain, and so you have to show ways in which you're actually going to get those emission reductions that are featured in the future deployment. You can see that we've been relying on this section in the Clean Air Act in our 2007 AQMP as well as in our 2016 AQMP, but we've been able to reduce the amount of emissions that are put in that category. And so we have been making progress in further defining measures and further being able to get emission reductions. So this draft contingency plan, this is the submission that we have to make to EPA by the end of this year. And this outlines the measures that we're going to have in place to cover this contingency. So it's going to be a couple of components. First, we're the identified emission reduction strategies that we have in place. So we basically go through and add up everything that we've been able to put in place since the 2016 AQMP. We also then point to additional funds for incentive programs. We know that incentive programs are very effective at being able to get further emission reductions as we're able to turn over older equipment in the fleet. And then finally, as a very important category, is looking at federal measures and responsibilities. We know that in California, we have limited authority over mobile source emissions, and the mobile source emissions are the biggest contributor to NOx emissions in our basin, and the significant chunk of those emissions are really subject to federal authority, and so looking at those measures that we need the federal government to take in order to help us attain the standard. So moving on to the next slide, I'm now on slide 26 for those on the phone. Here are the identified emission reduction strategies that we've looked at since the 2016 AQMP. I'm not going to go through each of them individually, but if you kind of tick through them, we get to a tally of about 24 to 26 tons per day of NOx emission reductions. So that's getting there towards filling that 108 ton per day box, but it certainly doesn't get all the way there. CARB has also have some additional innovative measures. So We have measures we're looking at, like co-benefits from the climate change scoping plan, building electrification. There's some different emission standards, looking at some emission reduction measures we can do for locomotives, and then some other plans that they have in place. And then regarding additional incentive funding, in our 2016 AQMP, we identified that we needed about $1 billion per year in incentive funds in order to be able to attain the standard. We're still working on that, and we know we have a ways to go. Right now, our expected future funding, we've identified approximately $800 million over the next 4 years. And you can see the breakdown of where that money is coming from. That's a significant chunk of money, but it's still not enough. And so we're working on identifying additional resources that we can access. So one of which is our voting district authorization legislation, which is currently pending. But if we're successful in that, we hope to be able to raise about $1.4 billion a year that we could then use for incentive programs. And then, other mechanisms as necessary. We believe we can get 15 ton per day emission reduction from those total of those additional incentive programs. And so looking at the trends for major emission sources, I mentioned that the mobile sources are the ones that are really critical, the ones that are really driving our air quality issues. You can see for the sources that are controlled for California and then also for us, there have been a downward trend in those emissions. So we've had a great decrease for our light and medium duty vehicles, similarly with our heavy duty vehicles. But then the story's a little different when you look at those traditional federal sources. So if you look at emissions from aircraft, from ocean-going vessels, from trains, that's the bottom red line. It's stagnant, maybe even going up, ticking up a bit. That's the area where we really need to make some progress. And so now going on to slide 30, again, you can see the contribution of the federal sources. It's, a third of the pie that I have up there for emissions in 2023. And again, really focusing on the fact that we need to make progress with those emissions in order to be able to meet the standard. So what could some potential federal measures look like? We've identified what we think that could be. So for example, right now, EPA is in the process of their Clean Truck Initiative, where they're looking at revising emission standards for heavy-duty trucks. It'd be the first time that they've looked at that in about 18 years. But, there's some actions that they could take both for that emission standards as well as establishing an in-use standard that could get substantial NOx emission reductions. There could be some efforts that they could take on ocean-going vessels to be able to ensure that the cleanest vessels that are in the seas call at our ports. That would have a very big impact on NOx emissions for us. Ocean-going vessels are going to be the top source of NOx emissions in our basin by 2023. Similarly, on locomotives, there could be some actions that the feds could take in terms of directing Tier 4, which are the cleanest engine standards for locomotives, to visit our basin. And then on aircraft, aircraft are also a major source of NOx, and we don't have, where there's a lot of preemption about what authority we would have to control aircraft emissions, so that's another thing that the feds could look at. So on slide 32, looking at our emission, the strategies that we've identified for our contingency measure. I mentioned before the identified emission strategies that we have in our basin gets 24 to 26 tons per day. We think we can get about 15 ton per day on additional incentive funding, and then that leaves 67 to 69 tons per day on the federal side, where they could take some emission reductions and get us to that 108 ton per day number. So we're really looking at, I think, a call to action is the title of this slide, but looking to see where we can, what steps we can take. So from our perspective, we're doing all we can. You've taken all the actions we can do, consistent with our authority, consistent with current funding availability. We really need all levels of government to step forward and take action to address our air quality issues. At the same time, work collaboratively to be able to make those reductions. Bottom line is we need further incentive funding to be able to continue to turn over the fleets and get rid of that older, dirtier equipment. But at the end of the day, we really need federal action to help us on sources that we either lack the direct regulatory authority or they're better controlled by the federal government. So moving on to our public process, where we are right now, we've released our draft contingency measure for public comment, so that's out and available. We're going to our mobile source committee on the 18th to be able to talk more about where we are on this. And then we also have a public workshop scheduled on the 18th of October. In November, we'll be going back to our mobile source committee. And then in December, we will be bringing this contingency measure plan to our board for consideration. So if you're interested in this process, and I'm sure everybody around the table is, a good way to stay informed is by signing up to receive newsletter updates from us. So you can subscribe to us on our website. And then with that, I'll turn it over to folks for any questions.
All right, just before we do that, before I get complaints, this document was released yesterday. We were releasing it in anticipation of the workshop next week. It just happened to correspond to a day before this working group. So I understand people have not had enough time to review this. We didn't expect you to review this. This is, this is still higher level in the slides. If you have reviewed it, we're happy to dig in and happy to dive into the document. But we completely understand we did not give you enough time to review this for this meeting. But we did want to get it out because of the workshop next week. We wanted to give people time for that public workshop. So having said that, happy to open it up to questions. So.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Kim Fuentes with the South Bay Cities Council of Governments. And my question is, what is the process for notifying the federal government about your recommendations? What is that, and what's that timeline?
The timeline is by the end of the year, under the Clean Air Act, by the end of the year, this submittal is due. It's essentially due by the end of the year, by the beginning of the year, 3 years before the emission reductions are due. So that's why we want to go to our board in December and get it through the CARB board, and then it goes to EPA, hopefully by December 31st is the timing.
So just those recommendations are just in this plan. There's no activity outside of what's in your submission.
Well, the plan needs to, once it goes to EPA, there's an approval process. So they have to take a series of actions, either deeming it complete or incomplete, and then moving on to whether it meets the requirements of the Clean Air Act in terms of a submittal. So they have essentially an 18-month timeline from receiving the plan in order to take an action. And again, we didn't get into the details, but if if they disapprove this plan, then that starts what we call a sanction clock. So there are federal sanctions if we don't have an approvable plan that we would have to remedy by the time those sanctions were going to kick in. Otherwise, we will have those sanctions. And if there's any doubt that the Trump administration had an interest in sanctioning California, I could refer you to the letter to California from Wheeler a couple weeks ago that had already threatened to do that even before this is being developed or submitted. So Adrian, you're going to back me up on that, right?
Well, I've just got a couple questions. So one of the reduction strategies you talked about was reliance on AB 32 scoping plan. One of the examples was building electrification. I'm just wondering why, regulating an area source for NOx emissions is squarely within the authority of the air district. Why not have some contingency measure around that goes above and beyond what you envisioned in CMB 02 from the last air plan? It seems like that's another place to get additional emissions reductions and something you could clearly write a rule right now, or with the formal process to do.
Yeah. We're open. I mean, obviously this is a challenging document to put together with the short amount of time and a large amount of emission reduction. So if I failed to mention it before, this group is about coming up with new ideas of things that we can put in that first box of new either innovative strategies or rules that we could commit to EPA that we will adopt very soon that will be defined emission reductions. So we're open to all ideas about things we might be missing. We did have several measures in the 2016 AQMP about pushing the envelope on some efficiency measures, as well as taking credit for some of the other statewide efficiency measures. And we haven't done fully that work. We don't think there's a ton of emission reductions there just yet, but we're open to ideas about how to get some credit for that and move the bar forward if we have other ideas. So that's a great suggestion, and we're happy to discuss it.
And then that, is the second thing, as a pleased that you said all levels of government need to take action to reduce emissions, because right now it seems like the plan's focused on 3 agencies, CARB, AQMD, and EPA. And while those are really important agencies, it seems like it's leaving out SCAG and our transportation plan. While I agree that some of the reductions should come from the vehicles themselves, it seems like there's some ability to get reductions just from the transportation system itself. And those are decisions that are inherently local about what types of transportation projects are being built. So I'd really recommend looking at some way to get some reductions from the actual transportation system itself, because I think it's an important aspect of this problem.
Right. So I've been talking to Rongsheng about, we've already setting up meetings with SCAG. They're working on their 2020 regional transportation plan. It's an opportunity to engage and see if there are any additional reductions we can get there. In recent years, because the light duty vehicle fleet has been getting so much cleaner, that as you reduce VMT for the light duty fleet and you take a relatively clean vehicle off the road, the bang for the buck is pretty low. But I think we're at the point now in the transportation system where we need to start thinking about efficiencies for the heavy duty fleet, or parts of the transportation system that provide incentives for cleaner heavy duty fleets. So we're going to be engaging in those discussions, and to the extent we can make some progress, we'll bring them back to this group either as part of this submittal or the 2022. It's probably going to be more for the 2022 AQMP, just because of the timing of getting an RTP through. But if there's any emission reductions that we can add to this current document, we're all ears.
Adrian, I appreciate you bringing that example to the table. Not unlike what your first question was in terms of can the district take some action on its own. I'll draw your attention to 3 of the measures that CARB is looking at on the innovative side that pair up what we're doing on climate with the benefits we can get for criteria and for NOx reduction. So from a statewide perspective, the opportunity for land conservation, the opportunity for perhaps a statewide pricing policy, as well as other VMT reductions. And that doesn't then, or that can mesh with what Phil was saying with a local element engaged with SCAG.
Yes, hi, Dwayne Baker, San Bernardino County Transportation Authority and Council of Governments. I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity, since we have folks from CARB here, that when you're looking at VMT reduction, and there's a lot of things that are still being discussed about how best to do that. At the same time, the state has just released figures for housing needs. And the Inland Empire is going to get hit with a large percentage of the increase in Southern California for housing. That means people are having to drive from the Inland Empire to job-rich areas. And so it's going to be important to align the housing priorities of the state along with the needs for vehicle miles traveled. Now, one possible way is to help us with things to encourage work from home, to ride sharing and van pooling. We only have 1% right now in transit. And we can do a lot of investments, and we have millions of dollars in investment going into new transit opportunities in the Inland Empire. That's still not going to raise the bar far enough to get the kinds of VMTs that you're looking for. So help in some of those other areas, but something to keep in mind that we have to have alignment between the housing goals of the state along with the VMT goals.
I appreciate that, absolutely. One new effort that will be underway, actually starting very, very quickly, there's already a mandate that our board, the California Resources Board, meet twice a year with the California Transportation Commission. Legislation just passed this year now requires the Housing Community Development to be engaged in those meetings. So that is one opportunity to do something that you're describing. Absolutely necessary. We view those as 2 sides of the same challenge.
skipped me, I noticed that. Just kidding. Rita Loof with Rad Tech. It would be helpful to get the letter to Wheeler that you mentioned. I'd be interested in that. So maybe if you guys could send
I think
it out.
Kurt
to
has
the
it
committee.
memorized.
Okay. And then my question is on slide 28. What is the status of the voting district authorization legislation?
So it was a bill in the legislature this year, but it was it didn't get out of committee, so now it's a 2-year bill. So we're continuing to work on it. We're continuing to work with local stakeholders, and hopefully we'll get some motion on that next year. It's probably only in time to get something on the ballot in 2022, unfortunately. So we've lost another couple years because it didn't make it through this year. But you want to?
Yeah. Rita, give me your email. I will email you the letter, and I'll be so generous, I'm going to email you 2 letters. One letter from Administrator Wheeler. The second is our response letter, which was signed this morning. And anybody else that wants copies of those 2, you get a 2-for-1 today.
Let's go here and then to Thomas.
Hi, Alex from the San Gabriel Valley COG. Just a follow-up question to the photo district authorization legislation. Is there a backup plan in case if the ballot fails?
Well, you know, the hope was if we can get it through this year, which is not happening, we would have 3 or 4 years of revenue that could almost cover this entire gap. That's not happening. So we've reduced the anticipated emission reductions from that, assuming it's through in 2022, to about 15 tons per day. If that is not achieved, it needs to be made up elsewhere. So one of the things to look at is if you look at the federal measures, that it says up to, 78 tons a day, but in our accounting, we only attribute 60-some tons a day to them. So that's one place to make it up is, again, more federal action. And when we say federal action, it can be regulatory, but it's also about incentives as well, right? We have not been as successful at the federal level in increasing the funding amounts as we have been at the state level. Like since the 2016 AQMP, we've more than doubled the monies that are going towards these types of incentive programs locally, which is a huge success, not $1 billion a year, but in the $200 to $300 million range. So that's a success. It's not enough, but if we can't get this through, if we can't get it passed, then you need to make it up with other measures. And again, we feel that the federal government, if you look at those charts and you look at the federal sources, those have not kept pace with the sources, the stationary sources or the mobile source strategies that CARB has adopted over the last several years. So we cannot do this alone. We've said many, many times that the states under the Clean Air Act are held responsible for bringing areas into attainment, but we don't have all the authorities necessary to do so. So, Thomas?
Thanks, Phil. I had a question about the 3 to 5 tons per day of NOx emissions under the ports line item. How was that 3 to 5 tons determined? Because I don't think we've gotten to the point in the ports technical working group of developing those numbers, right? So what is the source of these numbers?
Yeah, that's correct. So as you all know, we're currently in the process of developing an MOU with the ports of LA and Long Beach under the direction of our governing board. And one of the main strategies that we're looking at is the ports CAP, Clean Air Action Plans, Clean Trucks program that would set a truck rate for all trucks entering the ports, carrying loaded containers, and would essentially exempt zero and non-zero trucks. So the basis of the 3 to 5 ton, as Thomas correctly stated, is as we stated, is very preliminary at stage. We have a technical working group that we established with the ports, with PMSA, with environmental organizations that we're trying to refine that value, but we felt we needed to come up with a preliminary estimate for now, and hopefully in the next couple of months refine it once the ports actually adopt a rate or come up with a rate, and then Based on that, we can back calculate in terms of what the potential reduction would be. But the 3 to 5 tons is based on a very conservative assumption that if you had about $50 to $100 million a year over 3 years, and basically you require near zero trucks, you could get about 3 to 5 tons a day. So it's a very rough estimate right now, and we recognize that.
So would this estimate be updated based on the work of the ports
Yes.
technical working group? Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
It's very preliminary, and the truck rate is probably the major component that we think we can get creditable emission reductions. There's other components of the cap and the MOU that we might be able to get a little bit more as well. But we're being pretty conservative. We're looking at the lower end of the different rates that they were looking at in their rate study.
Hi, Richard Parks. I had a question about slide 13 on the current incentive RFP that's out. And so it notes that looks like about $50 million is currently being spent, and the anticipated reduction in NOx is 88 tons per year. So if we divide that by 365, we get approximately a quarter a ton per day of NOx reduction. So that implies that $50 million gives us a quarter a ton a day of NOx reduction. If we extrapolate that out, it seems that the cost of 15 ton a day reduction in NOx would cost over $3 billion. So I'm curious.
So,
can you explain?
Yes.
What would? Yeah.
So not every project has the same cost effectiveness, right? So these projects were something new to the district. We have collected over many years a lot of mitigation funds, penalty funds that we end up putting into these special funds that accumulate and have specific purposes. And some of those specific purposes are to mitigate other emission reductions, or when they have certain requirements. Each fund has certain requirements. So what we did, instead of going to each of these dozen or so of funds and say, okay, we're going to have a program for this fund and a program for that fund, we had a blanket RFP that said, give us your good ideas for emission reductions, and we'll match them to different funds, and we will evaluate them. It wasn't necessarily maximizing emission reductions for several reasons. So number one, there was, of that 48 million, only a portion of it went to what we call deployment projects or pure implementation projects. So some other money went to tech demonstration projects. So that's not included in the 88 tons per year because we're trying to advance technology. So that's one reason it's not exact. The other reason is, for the first time, we had more of a coherent program to fund stationary source reductions. So at this point, some of those funded probably didn't have the same level of cost effectiveness as we can get when we change out a locomotive, or when we change out hovercraft, or even change out a truck. But we need to get our feet wet in some of these stationary source programs, residential programs, commercial programs that we hadn't really done in a holistic way before. So while we have a very wide portfolio here, it wasn't purely maximizing cost effectiveness, because we needed to set ourselves up for the future, try some things, do some demo projects. So typically that ratio is a little better than that. Typically, for a very rough back of the envelope calculation, is for about $100 million, you should be able to get about 1 ton a day. That's what we had in the AQMP, about 15 years, $15 billion. This was about half of that, because of the tech demo projects that have future potential emission reductions if the technology pans out. It could be much greater, or because we were kind of getting our feet wet with some stationary source non-traditional incentive programs to see how we can make those more efficient and get the cost effectiveness to where we want it to. So this isn't the best place to look for that ratio. But we have other ways to see how we're doing with that on the mobile source side that we can share at some time.
Lakshmi Jairam, Future Ports. I have a question on slide 28. Your 15 tons per day number on that slide, is it based on the 800 million over 4 years expected future funding, or have you also included the additional funding needed to estimate your 15 tons per day?
Yeah, so that would be based if we could get the voting district authorization, and then there's a ballot measure to raise a half-cent sales tax locally in our district. That would raise about 1.4 billion a year, maybe even a little more in 3 years with inflation. And that we think we can achieve 15 tons per day, which is essentially that ratio that I had just mentioned. So that's what that comes from. That's by no means assured. We're not pretending like it's a done deal. But we need to do this submittal to EPA to tell them how we think we can get there. We need everyone's help to get there. So measures like this that can get 15 tons a day are very important. That measure would also help. We have other attainment deadlines beyond 2023. So even though that would not get us all the way to 2023, if a measure like that passed, we would almost be assured of attainment in our next deadline in 2031 with that level of funding. So we haven't talked too much about that. So there's still value to that, even though it doesn't get us all the way to 2023.
Okay. I had another question. Looks like most of your reductions are based on potential federal measures. What is your feeling about EPA accepting those measures?
In the past, they have generally been reluctant to do so, although in some sense, in some specific cases, they have. So we're going to make a very strong case that you cannot hold us accountable for things that we can't control, and that they need to take responsibility for the sources under their control, whether that's a regulatory approach or Congress allocating the funding necessary to bring about the change, just like California is allocating funding to bring about the change. Whatever it is, it's their responsibility. And we will be advocating very strongly for that. We have been. We led an effort to get them to work on a new low NOx heavy duty truck standard that they're currently working on. CARB has put in a petition for them to work on a new railroad standard. There's going to be measures that we're all working on collectively to do what we can on those federal sources with whatever local authority we do have, which is limited, but we're trying very hard. And we're working on the railroad ISR, we're working on other measures too. It's not going to get all of it, but with the federal authority, you can get a lot more. Okay. Hold on, Adrian. So, Rongsheng.
Thank you, Phil. I just want to respond briefly to the comments earlier regarding SCAGSAF. As many of you probably aware, SCAG is currently in the process of developing our next RTPSS. We call it Connect SoCal. And for this next cycle of RTPSS, actually we are making great effort for two reasons. One is we have a more stringent so-called budget in terms of the criteria pollutant. The budget set in the latest in South Coast, for example, in 2016, AQMP, the budget is much more stringent. Secondly is the GHG reduction target. SCAG also received higher 2035 targets this time around. So we are certainly aware of that and making a great effort. And also, as you may be aware, we are scheduled to release our draft next month. So you're welcome to go through, I believe, 45 days public review. So you're welcome to review our draft plan and provide any suggestions, great ideas. We'd love to hear. In addition, with regard to the housing and the VMT reduction, SCAG also is the process of, if you are not in a housing, called RHNA process, Regional Housing Needs Assessment. So that's integrated in with our RTPSS process. So that's a joint effort to make sure the housing needs and the air quality goals, etc., all are in sync. And that's a separate related process. So you're certainly welcome to participate in that process. And finally, I just want to mention that SCAG also prepare a portion of the South Coast AQMP. It's commonly known as the Appendix 4C. That's our transportation plan and control measures. And I think for these later this year's due plan, this will be really our last 2016 RTPSS, and our current 2020 RTPSS will contribute to the 2022 AQMP. Thank you.
All right, back to Adrian.
Yeah, I mean, and I appreciate that the budgets are more stringent, but at the end of the day, I don't envy the jobs SCAG has because it seems like we're putting them on a false path because the budgets are built assuming you close the black box. All evidence is showing we're not closing the black box. So they're about to embark on this transportation planning for the emission budgets for that the 2008 ozone standard with the presumption that we'll close the black box. I'd like to encourage us as we embarked upon the new AQMP planning effort to really kind of consider it's kind of unfair to the transportation planners to say, hey, here's your budget when that's predicated on doing stuff that we haven't been able to do and stuff that we don't know if the federal government's going to do. So I'd encourage us to kind of take this moment as a reflective point to kind of figure out, is there a way where we can develop better NOx budgets for our transportation system that are actually more meaningful? Because at the end of the day, we are building a system, as much as you blame it on the federal sources, we're building a system to accommodate and attract federal sources to our region. And the only other thing is, Can
I touch on that, Adrian, just for a second?
Yeah.
So two things. So number one, the timing is pretty, you could say it's good or it's bad, but because Rongsheng and SCAG are working on the RTP and beyond this submittal, we'll be diving right in the 2022 AQMP at the same time. They're going to be working on the 2020 RTP, and we could spend a good amount of time in the early months of the AQMP advisory group talking about the RTP, and I think that'll be a useful discussion, and we haven't really done that in depth before with this group, so I think that would be good. Second, don't presume the 2037, the new standard, is going to have a black box.
Good. All right.
Let's figure out a way to submit a plan, a 2022 AQMP without any 182A5.
You've listened to our comments from all the past 10 plans or so. And then I wanted to ask about the chart on page 30. So it talks about contribution of federal sources. And the way when I look at that, I see 33%. And obviously, I know it's hard for CARB, and there's some controversy around light duty right now, but isn't EPA just going to look at this and say, well, you have authority over a big piece of that pie? Or maybe I'm not understanding that chart in particular.
So one of the advantages we've had with USCP in the past is when CARB sets a standard for heavy duty, USCPA is followed. We're optimistic that USCPA will do that eventually in this particular case. But more directly to your question, it's a little hard when you look at slide 29 and understand with a multitude of lines, but it's important to realize when you look at that as we go forward, the federal sources will be more than the California sources that are regulated. So over time, what you're going to see in this pie chart is the federal sources continue to grow because California continues to take action. We're going to adopt a low NOx standard next year for trucks. And we're hopeful that EPA will follow in the relatively near term. There will be an election before they will act. We'll see what happens. So what you're saying is a possibility. We're hopeful that that will change.
And I think on the federal action piece, it is important to note that it's not, and I think Dr. Fine touched upon this, it's not just looking at regulatory action, but really looking at additional funding sources as well. Being able to take that action fast enough so that we see emission reductions in 2023, pretty much, it's going to be almost impossible to do that through regulatory action, right? So I think the incentive and the funding piece is really important.
All right, you guys function.
Thank you. Thank you, Otis Greer with the County of San Bernardino. Question, I'm going to take a quick step back talking about the legislation that is a 2-year bill. Having watched and monitored that bill through the process, I know that it struggled because one of the aspects is it was looking to create a measure in the format that transportation agencies traditionally use that are very prescriptive. They outline specifically what is going to be done with the dollars, whereas this tended to be a little more open-ended. I guess the question that I have as a layman, and I don't understand a ton of the NOx reductions and 15 tons a day, how do you translate that into layman's terms so that we understand that 5 metric tons means 10 trucks, 20 trucks, 5 cars, 50 cars? What does it mean? And then once you understand what it means, is it achievable?
Right. So obviously with the legislation, there's still a lot of work to do, working with our local and regional transportation agencies in cities and counties, and we're doing that outreach. We are also working on how we communicate the need for a measure like that, for legislation like that. We do have a history of success. If we do have the money, we know how to spend it, we know how to maximize those dollars and get emission reductions. Roughly some of the assumptions that go into being able to get a certain amount of tons for a certain amount of dollars are based on how much we have to spend to incentivize somebody that when they're buying a new truck that they go above and beyond the current requirements and get something 90% or 100% cleaner. So we don't need to go into detail here, but in the future we can have our incentive group talk about the types of projects they're doing and the types of benefits. We have spent, over $1 billion over the past, $1.6 billion over the past 20 years to achieve quite a bit of emission reductions that you saw. I mean, some of that progress you saw on those early slides were because of those incentive programs that not only directly reduce emissions because that truck is cleaner, but it drives the technology and drives the manufacturers to produce those vehicles or to get even cleaner because the market is there. We create the market. So I'm not the expert in how to communicate these things to the public, but we are working on how to do that. I think the first step is working with agents, like the counties and the transportation agencies, so they understand what we're trying to do and the types of things that this money can achieve, at least in the short term and the long term.
I appreciate that, I guess, but just to follow up, what does it mean? So yes, you can tell us that we can achieve X number of reductions, but what does that translate to? And is it achievable? In other words, I've heard lots of things like we need to take every vehicle off of the road in order to achieve the objective of the Clean Air Act or some of these other requirements that are looming. How do you translate that into layman's terms so we understand?
Yeah, well, what it does is it brings clean air to Southern California, finally, after 8 decades of struggle with dirty air. Now, we feel that it's one of the most efficient and fastest ways to do it is through these incentive programs in combination with regulations. But regulations take time, and you need to accelerate those benefits of the regulations through these incentive programs and, again, create those markets. So what does it do? It brings Southern California into attainment of the clean air standards and all the health benefits that come with that. If you monetize those health benefits, it far outweighs the costs. And we've shown that in previous air quality management plans. So that's what it does. And in terms of, you don't need to take every vehicle off the road. You just need to make sure that when people are getting new vehicles, they are getting the vehicles that are clean enough for the long term. And sometimes that doesn't happen because the current standards aren't tight enough to get us to the standards and the timeframes that we have. We have to get cleaner. And the regulations can kick in. You know, CARB's going to pass a regulation that every new truck sold either in 2024 or 2027 is going to be cleaner than those new trucks today. But how long is that going to take before the fleet turns over? So the money brings that forward, brings that technology forward, and gets it out there. I know I'm not answering all your questions, but we'll work on it.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I guess in the future, if it's possible, if you could bring a discussion where you could actually, through demonstration, tell us that we need to do X number of cars, X number of trucks need to be fleet turned over to this cleaner system by this date in order for us to achieve this goal. I think we need to see something numerical.
We have been working on that. We haven't presented it here. We're happy to present that at a subsequent meeting.
There is an existing document, Phil, and it's a few years old now, but I think it would still be relevant, and it's exactly that point. It's sort of in plain language.
It's Chapter 4 of the 2016 AQMP. There's a table.
Yeah, but there was another, and maybe it's in there too, but there was another document that was put together. I can't remember the name of it now, but it went through.
It's preliminary.
This.
We're redoing that. So as part of this effort and part of the 2022 AQMP, just so everyone knows, we are working on on some new calculations of how to maximize the incentive dollars and be very specific about what type of equipment, and to really make sure we really focus on the most cost-effective projects first. So that's in process. Some of that thinking has started to shape our thinking into this document, but we'll be sharing that probably more of the 2022 AQMP or as we move forward here if we need to, but it's just not done yet. If you look at the 2016 AQMP, Chapter 4, I think it's table 412.
420, actually.
420?
420, yeah.
So that was the last stab at how many vehicles need to be changed out to get so many reductions for this amount of money. But things have changed in 3 years, so we're taking another look at it and really trying to maximize the money.
Yeah, so table 419 and table 420 in 2016 AQMP. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor, to get about 7 tons a day of reductions, the affected population is about 350,000 vehicles in the light duty category. You go to the heavy duty category, this is pre-24 models. What was estimated here was about 30,000 trucks to get about 14 tons a day reductions. And it just goes through the kind of a calculation of what that number would look like. For construction equipment, it would take about 6,000 pieces of construction equipment to get about 7 tons a day reduction. So this is kind of a scenario, obviously would depend on the mix of categories and technologies and strategies that are going to be implemented. But these tables give you a flavor of what that may look like.
But as I said, as part of the 2022 AQMP, we are going to take another look at those tables and the latest technology, the latest prices, and try to do an update. David?
Thanks, Phil. For where we want to go, hypothetically, if you get all the incentive funding that you ever want, I understand technology is not quite there yet. The manufacturing side may not be there yet to support the number of electric vehicles that you need to get on the road. Has anyone looked at the realistic rollout of the technology of how quickly this could be made available and what you need, and how does that relate to attainment? If it takes 10 years to get up where we need, we're not going to get to attainment.
So on the zero side, I would say I agree that there's a few more years needed before the technology is matured, at least Class 7, Class 8 trucks. And the challenges on the zero emission side with infrastructure, because currently we're hearing that the cost of the truck is only half of the equation. You need to also cost to that high voltage charger. Hopefully that gets cheaper. Hopefully that gets better, and hopefully it advances quicker. In the meantime, we could get 90% cleaner trucks out there, 90% lower NOx, 100% lower diesel emissions, diesel PM emissions with the near zero natural gas engines. The production's ramping up now. We think it could ramp up to the point, the manufacturers have said it can ramp up to the point needed to have the change that we're talking about. The infrastructure is borne, the cost of the infrastructure is largely borne by the private sector at this point. So there's opportunities there. But you're right on the zero side, as much as we'd like to see it out there today, it's really not a on-road zero emission truck that's viable right now. We have set aside money in our funding programs to incentivize them, but the money's sitting there waiting for the availability of the trucks.
Regarding the near zero approach, is something my organization ordered 75 trucks, and the funding is being diverted away from near zero and is not, there isn't a uniform thought process of where the funding should go, understanding you can't rely on electrical right now, you can't electrify everything, and we need to fund what's available and get that on the road today. Has there been any meeting of the minds since CARB's here, South Coast is here? It'd be nice to have some understanding as far as what to do in the interim to make sure those vehicles get on the road.
I think there's been some more meeting of the minds recently, but I don't know if you guys are familiar. I mean, I think one of the things is the HVIP program was proposed to cut out a lot of the near zero funding, and I'm thinking CARB might be reconsidering that at this point. So we're I think everyone agrees that maybe not everyone, but a lot of us agree that the future is going to go to zero. We just, as a public health agency, we can't afford to wait. Others can advocate for whatever they want, but as a public health agency that needs to clean air in the short term, whether attaining standards or just providing public health benefits, we have to use what's available. We're being provided money to do that, and we can't sit on the money and wait for technology to, 3 years from now. Yes.
Adam with the BIA. Just want to say thank you. We danced around it with a number of the points, but obviously we are in the midst of a housing crisis, so we're very interested in working with you guys on anything that could potentially add to the cost of that. I know there's a couple points in here that adjacently touched on that, so looking forward to work with you guys.
Thanks for that. We're acutely aware, one of our facilities-based measures was on essentially construction, and we're taking our time with that one, given some of the factors that you mentioned. So, eventually we'll come back to that, but we got to be cognizant of the other policy issues that are going on in the state. So I don't see any other tags here, not that we won't have questions later, but I did want to go to the phone. I know there's a lot of people on the phone, so chime in if you will. If there's any questions on the phone, we'll take them now. Is there nothing on the phone? Well, as everyone knows, whether you ask a question here publicly or whether you want to email us questions that we can answer, or as we always say, if you have a particular group or individuals or company, whatever, who wants to meet with us individually on any of the aspects of what we're talking about, we're always willing to meet. It's not this working group. I mean, the advisory group is one thing, but there's a lot of activity that happens outside the advisory group if you want to sit down and chat about some of these issues. So is there any public comment from the audience back there? Any other questions around the table? We heard a couple things that we might want to touch on in the next meeting, but the one question I wanted to ask is, we're almost singularly focused on this submittal due to EPA by December. It's a short time frame. There's a lot of work that has to go into here, and we heard some discussion of that today, but we also heard some discussion already getting started on the 2022 AQMP process. I'm happy to get that 2022 discussion going if people are interested in getting started on that versus continuing to dive into this document. But is there a sense out there? Does anyone want to weigh in on whether they want to kind of do it in parallel, or really are we eager to jump into the 2022 AQMP now versus perhaps diving in starting January, February once this effort is done? Is there any thoughts on that?
My only thought is, I think this seems like there's some more dialogue that needs to happen on this, maybe at the next month's meeting. But it does seem I think we want to be relevant to the regional transportation plan development. So I think if we could front load those discussions to make sure we're relevant to their timeline. That's
Okay.
correct.
So how about we,
I was going to say, I would just add, as long as whenever you start the schedule, that you're giving adequate time for us to review documents and get back to you, because this is obviously very short. So if it, not that we want to have more meetings, but if we get more time to review information, and that would be helpful.
okay, yeah, and again, this, sometimes it just, the timing works out that it seems like you only have 5 minutes to review something, but we're going as soon as possible in anticipation of the workshop next week, so it just turned out that way. Okay, so it sounds like we'll start laying out some of the structure for the 2022 AQMP as we move forward, but there still needs to be time for you guys to digest this and ask questions. Again, submit your questions or comments anytime. You have our contact information, and we'll get through this. So any final comments from anyone? I appreciate everyone coming out. You know, if you've been on this AQMP group before, I think in the last AQMP we had, how many meetings? 14, 15 advisory group meetings by the time we were done, and we're starting about the same time. I don't think we necessarily, we'll have to decide whether we're going monthly or bi-monthly or quarterly. At some point, it will be monthly meetings as we dive into the 2022 AQMP, but we'll have to figure that out as we go. So, Zorik, anything else you'd want to mention?
Just people who are following us on the web or on the phone, if you have comments, and again, we encourage you to send your comments on the document as soon as possible to us, to either one of us or to aqmp@aqmd.gov. So that's aqmp@aqmd.gov, or any one of us that are sitting here. Thank you so much.
So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you at the next meeting. We'll send out information. Thank you.
Many times, just wanted to know. Thank you for the appreciate comments. Do you have your I know. I saw you. That's okay. I'm sure I see you right now. Good to see you again. Probably see you soon, right? If you have, is that meeting? No, they canceled it. Oh, yeah. Hey, how you doing? Sure, anytime. See you again.